It's great to be here with you, Lawrence, and to talk about your book and about then and now. But I want to start with the book. First of all, where were you in 1968 in life?
I was in high school in Boston watching all of this happen. And, you know, a certain amount of the book, as Frank knows having read it, is first person. It is a work of history. It's mostly about things that I did not witness, about things that happened in back rooms with Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy and Richard Nixon. But all of us who were at least in high school at that time were at home watching the Democratic Convention and watching all that madness unfold and reading the lips of the mayor of Chicago when he screams this anti-Semitic thing at Abe Ribicoff up there at the podium of the Democratic Convention. All that craziness we were all witnessing. We all gathered around our TVs when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, and 2 months later when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. We remember the New Hampshire primary night that began that whole political year for us who were watching it on TV. And I'll never forget, or I used to think that I would never forget, the night Gene McCarthy won the New Hampshire primary. Because that's what the coverage felt like if you were in high school and you glanced at the Boston Globe the next day or all the TV coverage. And this is absolutely true. It was decades later. Gene McCarthy came in second, but it was such a strong second against an incumbent Democratic president that he completely shocked the system and shocked Lyndon Johnson to the point where after Bobby Kennedy got in, Lyndon Johnson dropped out. But I went on into my life believing that Gene McCarthy had won the New Hampshire primary. And I was walking down the hallway of the Russell Senate office building around 1990 with your then senior Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And we were talking about some presidential campaigning something. And I made a reference to Gene McCarthy winning the New Hampshire primary. And he had accepted me in his presence at that point, to the point where he was willing to tolerate this ridiculous mistake. And his only form of correcting it without looking at me was just to say, he came in second. And and then I went back to the office after that and checked, oh, I didn't realize that. But that's how long the aura of the upset in New Hampshire lasted for me. And so a lot of this was first-person witnessing, and then the rest of the book is all digging through the amazing amount of resources we have that tell us that story.
There's some incredible literature about 1968. One thing that interested me, and many things, having lived through it myself, but it intrigued me about reading your book and the historical perspective we have now, Gene McCarthy, sort of half forgotten by a lot of people, whereas a minor figure in your narrative, Roger Ailes, would turn out to be part of the transformation of American politics, arguably ultimately played a larger role than McCarthy did over the sweep of history. Remind people what you talk about in the book about how Ailes surfaces in 1968, because I think some people don't know.
Well, in word count, Roger Ailes is a minor character. But he's in the very first sentence of the book for very good reason. Because in that first sentence of the book, he is meeting Richard Nixon in the makeup chair at the Mike Douglas show, which was the Ellen DeGeneres show of the day, in 1967. It's one of these kind of happy daytime talk shows and had mostly entertainment people coming on, singers, comedians, all that, and the occasional politician. It was unusual for a politician to go on. And Nixon's sitting there in the makeup chair, and Ailes, who's the young executive producer of this show, has come in to meet the former vice president, and who he knows is gearing up for a presidential campaign the next year in 1968. And Nixon starts into this thing about, why am I doing this silly entertainment show? I should be on Meet the Press. I should be in serious venues. And Ailes just lights into him, just goes on and on about everything Nixon doesn't understand about TV, everything Nixon has always gotten wrong about TV, including those presidential debates with JFK. Goes into all of that for a good 10 minutes, and Richard Nixon loves it. He just loves it, to his credit, and he wants this guy to come into his campaign and teach him TV and improve his campaign on the TV side. And so Ailes did that. And this is an election that Richard Nixon won by less than 1% of the vote. And so that's one of those elections where if you change one thing, if you just change one thing, this thing could go the other way. And the kind of TV that Ailes invented for Nixon, it was a kind of TV that's been used ever since, actually. These kind of fake town halls where we film them and then we cut them into commercials as if this was a real town hall and Nixon looks human and engaging with the people. All of that, everybody does it now. So Roger Ailes helps Richard Nixon get elected. He then helps all the Republican presidents get elected. He works in the Reagan campaign, the Reagan re-elect campaign, the George H.W. Bush campaign. Then Rupert Murdoch in 1996 gives him Fox News for him to create in his image and likeness, which he did, right down to the personal office behavior behind the cameras. And so then he helps elect George W. Bush from the Fox News platform. And then we, sitting here tonight, do not know who the President of the United States would be if Richard Nixon hadn't lured Roger Ailes into politics, because without Roger Ailes' Fox News, Donald Trump tonight would still be down on Fifth Avenue.
One other figure who you talk about considerably much later in the book, who I feel, as I'm reading you, reading others, going back and looking at the record, who's had a huge impact on the president, is George Wallace. And I say this, of course, as we're on the eve of a possibly fateful election in Alabama. I wrote down in 1968, this is from Dan Carter's book about Wallace, biography, had Wallace carried either New Jersey or Ohio, a shift of less than 1% of the vote, New Jersey or Ohio, from Nixon to Humphrey, would have thrown the election into the House. And in 1972, when Wallace ran again, he did even better. He won, of the 14 primaries, he won 5, came in second 5, won Wisconsin, which everyone was shocked went for Trump, but a lot of Wallace voters were in the North, and really might have beaten McGovern. He'd gotten more votes in the primaries for the nomination had he not been shot by Arthur Bremer. But it seems to me the Wallace model, and a lot of this comes through in Playing with Fire, is a lot of the template for Trump, and certainly Trump supporters. Talk about that a bit, and your thoughts about all that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think Wallace is one of the great underestimated forces in the politics of our past, which has given us the politics of today. And if you studied Wallace enough, as Frank's saying, you wouldn't have been that surprised by outcomes, by voting patterns in Wisconsin this last time around. George Wallace's 1968 presidential campaign manager told me last year that when he watched Trump campaign and listened to Trump campaign, he was listening to George Wallace. That was it. For him, there wasn't another Wallace until Trump. And it was all sorts of things, from language. In 67, George Wallace, who had, as all the Southern segregationist governors, they had lost the segregation battle. The courts had defeated them, and so they could no longer get up there and fight for segregation. So Wallace, who had said segregation forever in the past, by 67, as he's gearing up to run for president, he would tell reporters, "I don't talk about segregation anymore, I talk about law and order." And Nixon heard that phrase, law and order. And Nixon adopted that. He was the first Republican to be the law and order candidate. Every Republican since then has claimed to be the law and order candidate. And that really is an original phrasing of George Wallace, and coded specifically for the southern states, for them to understand exactly what he meant when he used it. You know, on the campaign trail, that's where the similarities between the two men, not just the candidacies, but the two men, Trump and Wallace, are so vivid. Because Wallace was the first presidential campaigner to decide that the opponents, the hecklers in the audience, were, and he had more than anyone, were the best thing that could happen to him. And so he would go up to Dartmouth in New Hampshire and he'd give a speech, and the Dartmouth kids would be screaming at him out there in the audience, and he would be yelling back at them and calling them communists and all of this. And what Wallace knew was, my voters are going to get to see me treat them the way they want me to treat them. And that's what he was reinforcing. And so he loved being able to show his voters what a fighter he was. And you cut to 2016, and there's Donald Trump standing up there at the podium as they're dragging out the protesters, saying, I want to punch him in the face. And that's pure Wallace. And there wasn't one campaigner between Wallace and Trump who thought, oh, the hecklers in my audience will be my most valuable players tonight.
Indeed, there was I can't remember if it was 68 or 72, there was a Wallace rally at Madison Square Garden where outside supporting him were the American Nazi Party and the KKK, the alt-right of that day, and inside there were African-American protesters who had to be hustled out, much in the kind of scene we saw with Trump, who he delighted in picking on. When did you decide to write this book in relation to the last campaign cycle?
It was a few years before the last campaign cycle.
I figured, but
yeah, I had no idea what was coming in 2016.
But what was the impulse that made you want to go back to begin with?
It was simply the dramatist in me. The last, I guess what I would call long form writing that I was doing were hour-long drama scripts on The West Wing on NBC. And that just gets you kind of addicted to the drama. And so I was just looking for the best drama I could find in nonfiction, and I wanted to work it in nonfiction, having worked in fiction for 7 years of that. And that's really what it was. And I just thought for a bit about presidential campaigns. That's always the best spot. And then it didn't take long to think what was the most dramatic, the most chaotic, the most violent, the most unpredictable presidential campaign we had ever had. And that was it. It was the craziest campaign. When you look at 2016, it's an absolutely perfectly normal campaign with highly corporatized campaign machinery, the kind of campaign machinery that was actually invented in 1968 by Richard Nixon. Everyone has been modeling that kind of corporatization of campaigning on the Nixon model from '68 since then. It was a completely standard campaign with the exception of one extremely eccentric candidate. But the rest of it, every other player, was a perfectly normal, kind of factory-issued political player that we'd been getting since 1968. You could even say, including that very surprising insurgency on the left side of the Democratic Party, which was simply Bernie Sanders following the path created by Gene McCarthy.
Totally, yeah. Tell me your feel. When I think back on '68 and my own feelings, I'm a little older than you. I was a freshman in college in '68, and it was incredibly dramatic, and it was at Harvard, and it was people were within a year would be sort of rioting in Harvard Yard, and the Harvard Crimson. There were practically fistfights over McCarthy versus Bobby Kennedy.
Yes,
crazy.
Right.
But the emotion to me of that period seems a lot different. When I was home for spring break in '68, my freshman year, which was Washington, D.C., I was in downtown Washington actually taking tickets at a theater when we got the news that King had been shot, and the riots were starting, and tanks appeared as I was driving home. I feel a lot of things about this Trump period, but it seems to me to have a different tenor than 1968 in terms of '68 feeling more apocalyptic at an emotional level, at least. I mean, to have Kennedy and King both assassinated back to back, as you talk about in the book, seems more powerful at some level than even what's happening now. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm curious to hear.
Oh, I completely agree with that. That 1968 was a much darker year than where we are now. Now, it is, I've discovered, an impossible case to make for anyone who wasn't at least in high school at that time. And I think a lot of us, after the last election day, had conversations like this with our kids. And my daughter was in college at the time, and pretty much everyone in her dorm was crying about this. And I remember talking to her and talking about how it has been worse. I suddenly became the old fuddy-duddy who was saying it used to be worse. And talking about 68 and talking about Vietnam and the threat that it meant to us. And she listened to all of that and said, okay, she's a history major, so she got it. And she said, but this is our Vietnam. And I think at a basic emotional level, a gut level, that is true, and it is certainly true for them. But there's a totally different surface truth to it, which was in 1968, there was a very personal threat, a very, very personal threat, that this election was about life and death, and it was about life and death of people who we knew. Because my older brothers all had draft cards in their pockets, and they couldn't plan a life, they couldn't figure out what they were going to do until they understood what was going to happen to them in relation to the draft and Vietnam. And my cousin Johnny graduated from West Point in 1968. He was dead in Vietnam in 90 days. That was the first military funeral I ever attended. His father had also graduated from West Point, and there are many faces of tragedy that you can see in the world, but nothing quite like a general saluting the coffin of his son killed in combat. That was another day in the life of 1968. My family's Vietnam funeral that year was one of over 16,000 Vietnam soldiers, American soldiers killed in Vietnam who had those funerals. 16,000 in 1968 alone. And just for a statistical comparative framework of the flow of grief and the impact, you have now an all-volunteer army, and so that changes the dynamics of the suffering, and it also minimizes the number of people who are involved in this. But in the entire 21st century, of all of our combat activities in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's 6,800 casualties. We've lost 6,800. That was less than half a year of 1968. And so that threat was very personal. It could be your boyfriend, it could be your brother, it could be you, it could be your grandson. Everyone felt it. Everyone knew someone who was at risk because of this war. And that's an immediacy and a personal impact that you don't have today.
Yeah, it just cannot be underestimated. The creation of the volunteer army or volunteer armed forces really changed the equation. And plus, you had domestically over the whole period of the late 60s, National Guard shooting student protesters in Kent State. You had really, the riots that you talk about of Chicago, the police riot in Chicago. The Republican Party, another theme in the book, or a series of events that you describe so well, the now forgotten Rockefeller, Javits, George Romney Republican Party, and what happened to it during the primary campaign and after, and the convention, and talk about that a bit.
Well, Frank's talking about the now extinct species called the liberal Republican. And New Yorkers used to vote for liberal Republicans, and they became extinct. And 1968 was their final moment within presidential politics. At the beginning of as the campaign was shaping up, there were two liberal Republicans who were taken very seriously as possible front runners, George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller. And they were polling well. It looked good for them, and that was a real possibility. And by the end of 1968, that's the last you're ever going to see a liberal Republican in presidential politics. And literally, New York City delivered the last liberal Republican standing on a Republican convention stage, which was John Lindsay in 1968, who was on the short list of possible vice presidential nominees, and he was conflicted about it because he didn't like Nixon, but then thought maybe he should do it. And not only did he not get the vice presidential nomination, but he was asked by Nixon and accepted the insult of being the person who would stand up there to second the nomination of Spiro Agnew as vice president of the United States. And so, and that was it. You know, they were able to hold on, you know, in governorships, in some Senate seats for you know, a while. They literally had to die out. And even when I was working in the Senate in the early 90s, we still had what we considered, on some subjects anyway, liberal Republican senators like John Chafee from Rhode Island and others who we would try to do business with and could frequently do business with. But that has disappeared, and that was a very deliberate design and choice of the Republican Party over time.
In Rick Perlstein, whom I know you cite in the book, who's written a trilogy of nonfiction books about essentially the rise of Republican conservatism, beginning with Goldwater. In the first volume, he talks about how when Goldwater lost in 1964 with a landslide, columnists at the New York Times, historians writing in the New York Review of Books all said, Republican Party is over. This is such a fiasco. Johnson had this huge landslide. You know, we have to worry that we won't have a two-party system anymore. The Republicans are in such sorry shape. And then, of course, there's, as you describe in your book, there's the rise of Nixon basically taking Goldwaterism and Wallaceism and repackaging it with code words. And then, of course, Reagan was already beginning his rise. If Trump vanishes in some way or another, we can talk about that in a second. But if in the aftermath, that's too cheap. Too cheap an applause line. I wasn't even going for it. Let's say that the Trump administration ends in scandal, whatever, resignation, whatever happens. I want to finish the sentence.
I do my little show alone in a room, so I never get to hear that sound. So I will pander to that sound all night.
So let's assume the worst case scenario for the moment for Trump. Oh, good. No applause this time.
You've worn them down.
I had to find the right wording, the most anodyne wording I could find. Anyway, I think what will happen is, and this could happen as soon as 24 hours from now if Roy Moore loses. No. There'll be a lot of premature, I feel, victory celebrations among Democrats and liberals saying, you know, the Wicked Witch is dead, just like when Goldwater, it was like I remember that, you know, even as a kid, it was such a sigh of relief because he was going to bring about nuclear Armageddon. He was against the Civil Rights Act. So here we have Trump, who of course now makes Goldwater look like Disraeli, you know, or Churchill. But it seems to me that the Democrats were self-deceiving in '68. They were self-deceiving in '64, and perhaps again after the success of Barack Obama. And I still feel the fractured Democratic Party that you describe in your book is very much still fractured, whereas the Republican Party that was emerging in your book has been pretty consistent since then and remains consistent even if Trump disappears, because while he's the worst case scenario of it, he's capitalizing on everything we've seen from Sarah Palin and the Southern strategy, Reagan, and everything else. So what's your sort of global view of it all, do you think, the two parties?
that is the one guarantee we have, is that after what is perceived as a big loss in a presidential campaign, or now even a close loss in a presidential campaign, it is the news media exclusively that comes up with, and pundits exclusively, that come up with this notion that that's the death of the Democratic Party, that's the death of the Republican Party. And there was a lot of that talk in 1968. And that's after Hubert Humphrey lost by less than 1% of the vote. And Hubert Humphrey was an extremely weak candidate. And so it's just always been wrong. Every time a party has been declared in disarray and hopeless, it has always been wrong. I can remember vividly the cover stories about the permanent majority that Karl Rove was creating from his perch in the first term of the Bush administration. And Karl Rove was the media's absolute darling, as the greatest genius who'd ever lived on the Republican side of our politics. Incomparable elevation to genius status. And Rove, I don't fault him, he was spinning everyone as best he could. That's what he was supposed to do. But that turned out to be wrong. And one of the things that I've really been glad about with this book is that reviews and reactions have not been partisan. And I'm going to share one that I got privately today, and I hope it's okay with him. I got a little, and it's because there's a wonderful piece of wisdom in it that's directly related to this question, and I wasn't going to do it. But I got a really warm email from George Will this morning about the book. And one of the things he said about it was that this shows, it's yet another demonstration of how much anger and alienation the major parties can absorb. And that was his word, absorb. And I actually hadn't really concentrated on that as I was writing the book. It's one of those lessons that comes out of the evidence as presented without me ever making that argument. And I love that George saw something, a case to be made that I hadn't specifically made, but it's absolutely there, because when you look at what happens to that Democratic Party in 1968, it is inconceivable that these people will ever even talk to each other again. Never mind unite around anything in the future. And you start to think that other parties could grow. And George's point in the email was, in other countries, when these kinds of devastating disasters happen to parties, they start to splinter off into new parties and create new parties. And this Democratic Party, this Republican Party, they can absorb and endure anything, and they're still going to be sitting there in contention the next time around.
I mean, what we've seen with the Republicans, I think, under Trump is it was all nonsense that there was this establishment Republican group that was different from the party that he was appealing to. His base is the party. They've accepted everything from beginning with insulting McCain onward to, sexual harassment, endorsing a pedophile. So that is the Republican Party. It seems to me that John Anderson died in the past week. That kind of independent if John Kasich and these people, they really have nowhere to go unless they started a likely doomed splinter party, right? I mean,
and Norm Ornstein, who is a nonpartisan analyst of these things, and I want to cite him because I'm not.
He's great.
I am not, for some reason, perceived as nonpartisan. I don't know. It must be something I've said. I don't know what it is. He makes the case that these two parties are no longer comparable. You can't say they both do the same thing, and that one of them has gone completely out of control in a direction of irresponsibility and no need to base their arguments, their positions, or their policies in fact. And that is a new world order for a political party. And so this is something we've never seen before, going off into this earth is flat environment. But it's not working. 60% of the country vociferously disapproves of Donald Trump as president. And then there are plenty of people who are in the positive Trump side of those polls who don't like him. It is not hard when you go out there and talk to Trump voters who will tell you They think he's an idiot. They think he's an embarrassment. They think all of these things, but they also think abortion is murder. And so there's only one vote for them. It must be the Republican, and it must be Roy Moore in the case of Alabama, for example. And so, you know, and there are others who just say all they care about is that they want lower taxes and they don't care who says that. And I mean, certainly the Trump voters that I know in Massachusetts, which is not exactly the same thing as the Alabama Trump voter, I haven't met one of them who doesn't think Trump is a buffoon. But they want lower taxes or they're anti-abortion, and that's where their vote is.
Right, and you know, cynically, there are people like, you know, Gary Cohn in his administration, or Stephen Schwartzman, the New York financier, who support Trump and are probably pro-choice about abortion, but cynically want their...
All the Trump memoirs, all the Trump administration memoirs are going to be competing with what phrase do I come up with to outdo Rex Tillerson on...
Moron.
Fucking moron. You know.
Let's talk for a second about that third of the country that is unwavering in support of Trump, has been, and in my mind, you can trace it back to '68. It's sort of the Wallace vote. It's the vote that supported Nixon after his reelection and through much of Watergate. That's 32 or 33% of the vote. After Hillary Clinton lost, there's been a lot of sort of breastfeeding among liberals that, you know, we've all read Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy. You know, the Democrats have to go and talk to these Trump voters and convince them they don't give a damn what any Democrat's going to say. They're not going to. They're going to watch Breitbart and Fox. They're not going to watch you. They're not going to read, you know, liberal publications like the ones I've worked for. And that, to me, though, is an indicator of how lost the Democrats are. That they think this stable group, a minority of the country, 1/3 of the country, can be converted, because I think that's sort of a wasted effort.
Well, again, that's mostly a columnist and pundit exercise. I haven't watched too many Democrats going out there and trying to do it. There are Democrats in states like West Virginia, like Joe Manchin, who has to do it every day.
Right.
He has to be able to talk to both of those sides every day. And the Democratic Party used to have those senators in Georgia as recently as when I was working in the Senate, you know, Georgia, Alabama. Here's how it feels to me, like it wasn't that long ago, but when I was working in the Senate, both of the Alabama senators were were Democrats. Including, by the way, the current senior Republican senator from Alabama. He was a Democrat when I was working in the Senate. He switched parties after the election of 1994 when the Democrats got wiped out. You know, look, I don't think there is a conversion policy that you can come up with and put in a 30-second TV ad in politics. And I don't think there's something a politician can say to convert what's left of the Trump support base. They probably aren't going to move, or they're going to move over a very slow period of time that you can't use in politics. And by that I mean segregationists in 1960 were not segregationists in 1970. I mean, some of them still had their heart there, but some of them didn't. Some of them genuinely changed their minds. There were pro-war, pro-Vietnam War people in 1964 who were anti-Vietnam War in 1968, including, by the way, United States senators, because Gene McCarthy and all the rest of them, except for one, voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that allowed for the escalation of the Vietnam War. A bunch of them changed their minds in a number of years, but they didn't do it overnight, and they were reluctant to change their minds. So people do change their minds, but within the political window that you need them to change their minds on things like attachment to Donald Trump, 4 years is usually too short a window to get that to happen. But there's always hope in the longer term. And I can never let go of that because of an experience I had right here in New York City back in the early 90s with Senator Moynihan. He was doing the Today Show one morning. And the Russian ambassador to the UN was also doing the Today Show for reasons I can't remember at the time. And this used to be, this Senator Moynihan, of course, was the ambassador to the UN when it was the Soviet delegation. Soviet Union has since collapsed, the Berlin Wall has come down, and now here is the Russian ambassador to the United Nations over there in the corner of the green room with his gang, I think I can use the word, because Pat Moynihan was sitting with me in a corner saying, I think that one's KGB, and I think that one's KGB, because he's recognizing some of the faces in that group who he believed were KGB agents back when they were in the Soviet delegation. And so Pat Moynihan has to go on first and do his segment, and so we're getting up to leave the room, and we're walking out of the room, and the guy who he had fingered first of all as a KGB agent, the toughest looking one of all of them, comes running up to Senator Moynihan as he's going out the door to go do his segment. And he says something in heavily accented English that neither one of us can understand. And then he says it a second time, and we hear a couple of the words of it, but we haven't put it all together. And then the third time he says it, Pat Moynihan's face lights up like I'd never seen it before, because what he's saying, looking up at Senator Moynihan with this big smile, is, we were listening. And in that instant, Senator Moynihan's life was rewarded because he had lived a life of hoping that you were listening. As his students in lecture audiences at Harvard, he was hoping you were listening in the United Nations, but he never really expected you were. He was hoping you were listening on the floor of the United States Senate, but he never really expected that you were. And it turned out that the most important listening that he could ever have been validated on was by the people who actually were on the other side of that Berlin Wall, the other side of that Cold War, which ended without a shot being fired because, among a bunch of other forces, they were listening. They were listening to a condemnation of the Soviet Union by this American ambassador every time he talked about them in the United Nations, and they were still able to very slowly, over time, process it. And so pessimism has no business living in a world with that story.
Well, that's encouraging. In writing the book, what were the things that you've forgotten that you rediscovered, or what were the surprises, if any, as you looked at this year again and all this material and sifted it through your grown-up self? What were the things you didn't expect that hit you?
Well, I was an uncompromising anti-war idealist in high school and college, and so I never saw gray areas. And there's nothing makes you understand the gray better than going to work in the United States Senate. And so I worked there for close to 8 years, and I see it all so differently now, and I have a whole set of sympathies that are different, and just genuine understandings. I mean, I was one of those people who, because my brother Kevin had gotten clean for Gene and shaved the beard
clean for Gene,
and cut the hair and gone up to New Hampshire to help with the McCarthy campaign, and McCarthy was the first anti-war candidate, so I was with McCarthy, but then highly conflicted when Bobby Kennedy got in as a Boston Irish Catholic kid. They were our heroes. And yet the Bobby thing seemed opportunistic to me, and I was bothered by it. And now I understand, which I didn't know, that Bobby was thinking about running long before Gene McCarthy. And the people who were begging Gene McCarthy to run had already been begging Bobby to run. I didn't understand any of those dynamics. It also, I was not thinking in 1968 that Bobby Kennedy is the only person in American history, until Teddy then does it years later. But at that point, the only person in American history whose decision to run for president has to include a calculus about what is the likelihood of a copycat assassin wanting to get the next Kennedy on his way to the presidency. And I wasn't thinking about that when I was watching what was happening in 1968. And so there's all sorts of personal dimensions of the men and the women involved, like Abigail McCarthy, Gene McCarthy's wife, who is just the most astonishingly wonderful character I could have come across in writing about this. It's mostly in there. It's mostly in who these people are, who they were, what they were thinking, the fact that Jackie Kennedy wrote the most poignant and important passage in what was Bobby Kennedy's 1964 convention speech, the speech for which he got a 22-minute ovation before he spoke a word. And then Jackie's own personal prediction that when Bobby started running for president, which she supported, she privately told a confidant that she thought that what was going to happen to Bobby was the same thing that happened to Jack. It's all of that. It's this amazing backstage experience that you get to have in this story. And that's what I care about the most, because I have to say, having lived backstage in government and politics, I care virtually nothing about what happens on the stage. I mean, the worst night of the year for me is the State of the Union address. For whoever's giving it, you know, where I have to pretend something important has just happened in a speech. And yeah, I have to tell you, inside government and politics, no one is held in lower regard than these speech writers, because the people who actually do the governing think the speech making is the silly part of it, and it's the oversimplification and the cheerleading part of it. And so my own attraction is always to what was going on in the room where the doors closed.
You know, if I may say so, a positive thing about Trump's campaign was that he did,
I didn't hear any applause for that.
was that he did, in his crude sort of bull in a china shop way, completely demolish a lot of the conventions and stagecraft of American politics. You know, he didn't have good TV ads. He didn't listen to consultants. He ridiculed polling. He showed that, you know, and whether it was for Hillary Clinton or on the Republican side, Jeb Bush, they were blindsided by this kind of breaking. They all believed in these rules. They believed you had to listen to consultants. You had to stage events that were silly as the State of the Union. And I don't think it's ever going to be the same again now.
Well, so the reason Trump was able to do that, you can throw away, you can break the rules, as long as you have one thing driving your candidacy. The only thing that allows you to break rules when it's driving your candidacy is hatred. And Trump's campaign was a hate-fueled campaign from the start. So if you hate what I hate, you can do no wrong. That is the strongest connection you can have to voters. And we've seen versions of that on the Democratic side, and we saw it in 1968. It is impossible. I think Frank will agree to this. It's impossible to overstate how much Lyndon Johnson was hated by the kids who went to New Hampshire to campaign for Gene McCarthy. Hated him. He was a personal threat to their own lives in him sending them off to Vietnam. He was despised. Richard Nixon was then despised. So much of the energy for Gene McCarthy and the could do no wrong in '68 came from this hatred, which we could call a virtuous hatred because it was aimed for this other good. And Gene McCarthy could do things as a candidate that no one else dared to do. He would stand up in front of audiences, and as far as the press was concerned, bore them to death. They couldn't believe how flat and boring some of these speeches were, and the McCarthy kids loved every second of it. They didn't need to cheer and applaud, you know, for every line. McCarthy was the very last presidential candidate ever who believed that the way to win hearts and minds and votes was to flatter the audience's intelligence. And he would do things like quote the most obscure poetry off the top of his head, and no one knew what he was talking about. But he could violate all those, you know, new rules about how dynamic and charismatic you were, and simple-minded you were supposed to be on the campaign stage, because he had this incredible power behind him, which was a hatred of the current regime and a hatred of the war in Vietnam. And so there is just nothing like hatred pushing a candidacy forward, because hatred includes 100% forgiveness for anything you do, as long as you're hating what I hate.
You know, I grew up, as I suspect you did, in a household that hated Nixon. But people forget the visceral hatred that Johnson, after these triumphs of the Civil Rights Act and all the rest of it, piled up. And you know, when there was all this hoo-ha over the summer about the Shakespeare in the Park, Julius Caesar, where Trump was, assassinated. at least someone who looked like Trump. People forget that the most successful off-Broadway play of the late 60s was a play called McBird, where Lyndon Johnson was literally accused of having contrived the assassination of JFK. And it ran for 12 months, 13 months. And anyway, so some very red meat questions.
Oh, good.
What happens if Trump fires Mueller?
Well, I don't know. I will say it's too late. The time to do that has passed because Manafort's already indicted. He's under indictment. There's a case number in a federal court in Washington. That case doesn't go away. Nothing makes it go away. The president cannot make that case go away. Now, if the president decides, I really do want to fire Mueller and make the case go away, okay, then you can pardon Manafort, but you've got a problem when you pardon Manafort. That just means that Manafort has to testify to Congress under oath publicly the next day, because once you're pardoned, you lose your Fifth Amendment rights, because you cannot self-incriminate over something you've been pardoned for. So he has no Fifth Amendment rights the minute you pardon him. He also is still liable for any crime of perjury he might commit while under oath. So everything about, and this has all been explained to an extremely depressed Donald Trump. When he was hearing this, he was going, imagine when you tell him, oh yeah, the problem with the pardon is he loses his Fifth Amendment rights, then he can say everything publicly tomorrow. Imagine Trump's reaction to that when the lawyers told him that. So it's gone too far down the road to be able to extricate. Same thing, but with Flynn, by the way. If you wanted to just pardon Flynn tomorrow, you could, but that makes him an available witness the next day under oath publicly to the committees. And so, it's a little too far down the road for Trump to be able to do any of this stuff effectively. But that's a long-winded answer to I don't know what happens, other than, you may open up some of these guys to be witnesses immediately if you also accompany it all with a pardon.
Here's a three-part question. I particularly like the first part. When do you think Trump will be indicted? Not if, just when.
Yeah.
And parts 2 and 3 are, do you think Jared and Don Jr. will be indicted, and will the indictments exceed the number of Nixons?
Yeah. It's hard. Nixon, it was over 40. Just in the Nixon administration. That doesn't count the burglars. It's hard to outdo Nixon. 2 Nixon attorneys general. That's hard to outdo. I don't think they're going to be able to outdo the Nixon administration. I have no idea, and I have no idea what the liability for Jared Kushner is all within that. That's the liability we know about is within the disclosure forms where he did not disclose things about his foreign contacts. And so he definitely has some criminal liability there. We'll see if it meets the threshold of a prosecution. I don't know. Donald Trump has obvious criminal liability on obstruction of justice for firing Comey and his stated reasons for firing Comey, and then his absolutely brilliant tweet. Just the most wonderful confessional tweet in history. We have a winner. We have a winner for stupidest tweet in history. And it's Donald Trump saying, when I, fired Flynn, I knew he had lied to the FBI. All this, fired Comey, all that stuff. It's he's just a miracle. The prosecutors are staring at that, saying, we've never, ever, ever had anybody like this who just serves up this stuff to us. And so, he has real exposure there. That's where I think, in terms of just the public record, I have no idea what his exposure is on, Russian entanglements. I have no idea what that might be. That's all guesswork at this stage. But, the Comey thing and that firing is a very clear place to explore obstruction of justice. But, I don't know if any of that stuff's going to. I'm very patient about waiting for these things to happen. And I don't know if that's, I guess I've learned that a few ways over time, but there's nothing like actually working in the Senate for developing your patience for stuff, for outcomes,
Do you think, indictments aside, do you think Trump lasts a full term?
Well, without indictments or an impeachment move, I don't see what else would do it. Clearly, the 25th Amendment is there. It's been put there for you to remove a president who's out of his mind, among other things. And it has to be activated by the vice president. The vice president has to personally activate the 25th Amendment by convening a majority of the cabinet to sign a document saying the president is incapable of fulfilling his duties. Mike Pence hasn't seen enough evidence yet. So I wouldn't hold my breath on the 25th Amendment. That leaves impeachment.
Well, one other possibility that occurred to me, but feel free to knock it down. What if Donald Jr. and Jared are in real legal trouble and there's some deal Trump could make to sort of save them and also possibly Trump businesses and get out while declaring victory?
Well, here's the thing. No one has ever been able to plea bargain impeachment. Because it's not a courtroom thing. This is the strength of it, and jurisprudentially, in a certain kind of way, the weakness of it. And we discovered this in the Clinton impeachment because I was no longer working in the Senate, but I was talking to Senator Moynihan about it a lot and seeing him a lot. And we all believed that there was this thing, called high crimes and misdemeanor, that there was a legal definition of what this is, of what impeachable is. And the longer we stared at the histories of impeachment, which are mostly of federal judges, it's exactly the same process, we realized impeachment is whatever the House of Representatives and the United States Senate say it is. It can be for anything. And the reason for that is that there is no judicial review of impeachment. You cannot appeal the impeachment verdict of the Senate to the Supreme Court. And remember, the founders could have allowed for that. They easily could have. They didn't. They made sure there's no appeal to the decision made by a political entity. And so they made impeachment political. We don't know what might be the impeachable argument in this case, but a prosecutor cannot possibly make a deal with you on behalf of the House of Representatives who operate in a completely different way. Everything you just said, a prosecutor could make a deal with anyone in the private sector, like Mike Flynn, for example, saying, here's our deal and you plead guilty and we're not going to touch your son, which apparently at this point in time might be part of the Flynn deal. The son has no legal jeopardy that we know of with the special prosecutor. Everything Frank described, a prosecutor could do with a defendant as long as this was all being done within the court system alone. But I don't know what that method is that allows you to make these kinds of deals. And it's a very tricky thing to figure out how Trump could plead out with Mueller in a way that protects his son and son-in-law. I don't know how to do it.
My only theory, and like you, I didn't go to law school and couldn't have gone to law school, is that it would not be about counts of impeachment per se from Congress, but it would be a political move, that there'd be indictments of family members, and maybe Mueller would give a report to Congress that would somehow speed the way for Trump to declare victory and go home. That's my half-assed,
But just in that scenario, the special prosecutor has to suddenly become political, okay? So let's just assume that the special prosecutor gets an indictment against Jared Kushner, an indictment against Donald Trump Jr., someone Donald Trump cares about a lot. And Donald Trump then says to the special prosecutor, I will resign the presidency if you drop those indictments. The special prosecutor is making a deal outside of the court system that is a political deal, and I don't know how Mueller would find his way to knowing how to make that deal.
Well, maybe he'll just...
We could go on and on about this.
Maybe he'll just...
We could do an hour on this. There's a lot of games.
We could really just factor in the 12 cans of Diet Coke a day. But last question here. If you were interviewing one of the participants of the 1968 campaign, to whom would you give the last word?
You know, I would give it to the person who gets the last word in the book, which is Gene McCarthy, because he's the one who started everything that gave us what became the 1968 campaign. If Gene McCarthy had not decided to run, Bobby Kennedy would not have run. Bobby thought about it before Gene, decided against it, thought about it again, decided against it, and then Gene does it, and then Gene does very well in New Hampshire. Bobby had already been thinking about it again because he saw McCarthy's poll numbers going up in New Hampshire, and Bobby jumped in. And part of Bobby's jumping in was the belief that Gene McCarthy wouldn't be able to take this to the finish line, which is a belief that I now share. I didn't share it at the time, but I do share it now. There were a lot of defects in McCarthy as a dedicated campaigner that I don't think he could have made it. And Bobby could have. So Bobby wouldn't have run. The election would have been Lyndon Johnson versus Richard Nixon. Lyndon Johnson probably would have won that. And we would have seen Vietnam go on in a very similar way to the way it went on with Nixon. And then Bobby Kennedy would have been, very likely, the Democratic nominee anti-war candidate in 1972, because he would not have been assassinated, because he wouldn't have been in California on the night of the California primary. So Gene McCarthy, the poet who decides to run for president, is a dramatist's dream. This is the most unlikely possible person. Bobby Kennedy was shocked to hear that Gene McCarthy had decided to run for president. Gene McCarthy didn't just read poetry, he wrote poetry, sitting in his Senate hideaway office when other senators thought he should be working. He would be writing poetry. He was the most intellectually removed and in many ways possibly the most intellectually sophisticated member of the United States Senate at the time. He was simply the most unlikely person. And what hit him was a moment of moral outrage in, of all things, a Foreign Relations Committee hearing when he heard Nicholas Katzenbach say that the administration believed that declarations of war were outmoded. And Gene McCarthy was outraged by that, and that's the moment where he said privately to his chief of staff that we've got to put the Vietnam War on the presidential ballot, and if I have to run for president to do it, I'll do it. And that's the decision that gives us everything that happened in 1968. The Republican side of the politics was going to be the same, no matter what Gene McCarthy did. Nixon was going to be that nominee. That worked all very smoothly. But it's McCarthy who created that year. It's McCarthy who created a hope in politics that the kids supporting McCarthy did not have before he emerged. And it was McCarthy who really gave us all the dynamics that we saw in that year. And ultimately, what Gene McCarthy did saved lives, because the last man to die for the mistake that was the Vietnam War was April 29th, 1975. If the first anti-war candidate had not run until 1972, that war would not have ended in 1975. We don't know how many more years it would have gone on, but it would have gone on. And so Gene McCarthy got the draft stopped, in effect, by the protest that was unleashed in the anti-war movement. The draft was stopped in January of 1973. That draft wasn't going to stop in January of 1973 if Gene McCarthy hadn't run in 1968. And so he is the person to whom we owe, first of all, a vibrant and strong and effective anti-war movement in our politics where the war could actually get on a presidential ballot. No one thought that was possible. He's the one who thought that was possible. And he gave us that year, including some of one of the most horrible things that you can imagine happening in that year, which was the loss of Bobby Kennedy. All of that happened because of this impulsive and principled and outraged decision made by the most unlikely person who could possibly have made that decision.
I encourage everyone here to read Playing with Fire and learn more about this, congratulations to you. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you very much.